Good morning. Thank you for joining us, or good afternoon, pardon me. We'll get started in a couple of minutes.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. We'll wait. It's just 2 o'clock now. Wait another minute or two here for a few more attendees to be able to sign in, and then we will get started. Good afternoon. We will go ahead and get started with the presentation. Thank you for joining us today. The purpose of today's meeting is to provide an overview of a draft opportunity to purchase ordinance that city staff have been working on this year. My name is Katie Topinka. I'm the Policy Research and Outreach Manager with the City of Minneapolis Community Planning and Economic Development Department. Also on the call today are other city staff members, including Roxanne Kimball, who manages single-family homeownership programs in the Community Planning and Economic Development Department, or CPED. We have Dean Porter Nelson from CPED, who manages many of our NOAA preservation and acquisition programs. We have Jessica Stone from the Regulatory Services Department, and Saray Garnett-Hooley, who is our Director of Regulatory Services for the City of Minneapolis. And then in addition, we have Michelle Basham on the line. Michelle is a consultant who the city has been contracting with over the course of the last several months to assist with this policy development process. Before I turn it over to Michelle to give a presentation of the ordinance draft, I am just going to give a little bit of background and then we will get started. Minneapolis policymakers have been considering an opportunity to purchase policy have been discussing it and doing research and related to it over the last couple of years. There was a City Council study session in September of 2019, where staff from Washington, D.C., as well as renter advocates from Washington, D.C. came and presented on the Washington, D.C. Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. Following the study session, the city contracted with Twin Cities Local Initiative Support Corporation, or Twin Cities LISC, and the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development out of Washington, D.C. And they created a study for the city about opportunity to purchase policy options. They did a number of stakeholder engagement sessions and peer city research and developed 3 potential policy options for the city of Minneapolis to consider. Those were presented to the City Council in November of 2020. After that time, in March of this year, the City Council directed staff to draft an ordinance based on one of the policy options from the report. So in response to that City Council staff direction, a team of staff, some of whom are represented here on this call today, from CPED, Regulatory Services, and the City Attorney's Office, have been working together with Michelle, who you'll hear from shortly, on developing an ordinance draft. The ordinance draft is based off of the staff direction that we received from the current City Council in March. So we are presenting this draft ordinance today to share with the community what we've been working on over the past several months and to get feedback on this draft. It is important to note that starting in January, the makeup of the City Council is changing, and our city government structure is also changing as a result of the election. This ordinance draft that we're presenting to you today, there will not be a public hearing on it prior to the end of the year with this current City Council. They have their last meeting of the year this week, and so if the next City Council decides to pursue an opportunity to purchase policy, it will have to be reintroduced. And so at this point, we don't know the next steps, but we did want to present this version today and get feedback on it to inform any future work on this type of policy. We will certainly provide updates on what next steps will be once we know more information. And if the ordinance is reintroduced, we will do additional stakeholder meetings. What to expect from today's meeting. Again, we're going to provide an overview of the draft that we have prepared up to this point, so that we can share it and get feedback on it. So we'll have an informational presentation that will be done by Michelle Basham, the city's consultant. After that, we are going to take questions, and the way to submit questions will be in the chat, and that will be moderated by city staff. And so we will answer questions about the content of the ordinance draft during the question and answer period. And then there is time set aside for attendees to provide verbal feedback in the form of comments, and you can also provide that feedback in the chat. There is also a website set up, and I believe somebody can put that in the chat, that also has a place where you can submit comments. And so we will provide those instructions about how to give your comments verbally if you'd like to do so when we get to that part of the presentation, but there will be a call-in number that we provide at that time. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to Michelle Basham to present the details of the current draft.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you everyone for making time to be here today and taking time out of your busy schedules to hear more about this important potential ordinance. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So while I wait for one of my colleagues to advance the slides, thank you very much. So as Katie talked about, this is really a complicated ordinance, and this has been in process for a while. Starting with some really wonderful and robust work that was done by several different people, including Gretchen Nichols from LISC, and we really appreciate the early work that they did on this. There are a couple of different jurisdictions across the country that have either passed a related ordinance or are currently considering an ordinance like this. For the city of Minneapolis, this really aligns with a lot of the policies that the city of Minneapolis has already adopted, really related primarily to some of the city's goals related to housing equity, renters' rights, and aligning the 2040 plan and the Unified Housing Policy Plan with some of our rental policies in the city of Minneapolis. For a couple of years now, the city of Minneapolis has been a majority renter city. And when we talk about that, what we mean is that the majority of Minneapolis renters are Minneapolis residents are renters. And for this reason, among other reasons, our Minneapolis City Council has made protecting renters' rights a priority. Next slide, please. Along with protecting renters' rights, though, we wanted to balance in creating this ordinance, balancing the rights of renters with also the rights of property owners, and wanting to create a process that was not overly onerous and time-consuming and lengthy. We believe that what we have put together does create a clear pathway for renters to be able to purchase property and create a pathway to ownership, as well as outlining specific rights and a process both for renters organizations, or qualified organizations, which we're going to talk about later, or the city of Minneapolis to purchase rental property while also balancing the rights of property owners. Next slide, please. Other potential benefits of this, we're going to talk in further detail in a little bit about qualified organizations, but part of the process that we've outlined in the draft ordinance, which certainly through these discussions and with several new city council members could change significantly, but with the draft ordinance, this allows nonprofit groups as well as BIPOC developers to get into the rental business as qualified organizations. The city of Minneapolis will establish a process for qualified organizations through a competitive request for proposals to participate in this process and have the rights under this process if renters or renter organizations do not choose to participate or assign their rights. And although we do not anticipate and rarely anticipate that this process will take the entire period anticipated in the outlined timelines, it does provide a reasonable period of time for renters and renter organizations to be able to organize themselves, to get financing, to do the things that they need to do in analyzing and proceeding with a purchase before they do so. Next slide, please. So next, we're going to talk about what rental properties are covered by the Opportunity to Purchase Ordinance draft. So overall, all rental properties in the city of Minneapolis are covered by this ordinance unless they are specifically excluded. There are, based on the data that we have available, approximately 23,000 rental properties with over 103,000 rental units in the city of Minneapolis. As I said, all of these are covered unless they are specifically excluded. And broadly stated, there are two different types of exclusions. One is based on residency and the other is based on things like transfers and revocations and estates. In terms of residency, it's going to be things like if it's an owner-occupied duplex, the owner lives on the property, or the owner lives in an accessory dwelling unit, or lives in the primary unit and rents out the accessory dwelling unit. New construction less than 10 years old is also excluded. Certain types of housing, subsidized housing in particular, housing that is licensed by the Department of Human Services or the Minnesota Department of Health is excluded. In addition, the ordinance as it's drafted right now also anticipates that small properties, meaning small rental properties, meaning 1 to 4 unit properties that are owned by individuals who have 5 or fewer rental licenses in the city of Minneapolis also would be exempted. As I said before, the other broad type of exclusion and exemption would be transfers within families, revocable trusts, some types of transfers after the death of a natural person, transfers of property to a public agency, or limited transfers of a corporation or organizational transfer where there is no consideration or direct financial benefit as a result. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we spent a lot of time thinking about in the process of drafting this ordinance was, again, going back to some of my comments earlier, is how it interacts with the city's goals related to racial equity in general, but also racial equity with regard to its impact on communities of color and home ownership amongst BIPOC communities. And so we looked at a variety of different data sources in analyzing that, including rental housing in what we call our Strategic Racial Equity Action Plan, SREAP, addressing specific zip codes within Minneapolis. In particular, in the North Minneapolis zip codes, including 55411 and 55412, as well as one zip code in South Minneapolis, 55404. And SREAP seeks to promote housing stability for renters in these zip codes. 23% of the small unit rental properties are in these zip codes, and 77% are in other zip codes. And in the next slides, we're going to examine this impact further. Next slide, please. So citywide, amongst small, again, we're defining that as 1 to 4 unit rental properties, subject to the Opportunity to Purchase ordinance is 18%. Exempt would be 82%. In SREAP zip code specifically, again, that's 55411, 55412 and 55404, which include 55411 and 55412, which is North Minneapolis. Subject to the opportunity to purchase ordinance is 31% versus exempt from the ordinance would be 69%. In terms of pure numbers, this would be based on the available data. Citywide, 20,901 properties. In SREIP zip codes specifically, 4,879. Next slide, please. So on this slide, what we are seeing is the same data just presented a different way. So citywide, there are 18% covered, 82% not, and in SREIP zip codes, 31% are covered and 69% are exempt. Next slide, please. In the next couple of slides, we're going to talk specifically about the process and the steps that are outlined in the ordinance draft. So the very first thing that happens, of course, is a rental property owner decides to sell their property and issues what we would call a statement of intent to sell. And when that happens, they need to provide to the renters, the renter organization, the city, and register qualified organizations an opportunity to submit a statement of interest to purchase the building. The way the ordinance is drafted right now, we have a cascading series of rights, meaning it starts first with renters and renter organizations. If renters or renter organizations decline to exercise their rights or don't respond within the required period of time, then the right falls to qualified organizations and the city of Minneapolis to execute their rights under the ordinance. Renters have a certain period of time outlined in the ordinance to submit a statement of interest. If they don't do this, like I said, then the right falls to qualified organizations. The other thing that renters and renter organizations can do, however, is assign their rights. One of the things that we chose after a lot of consideration and research of how things are happening in other jurisdictions, in particular, how they have worked in practice in Washington, D.C. with regard to assignment rights, there is a right of assignment under the draft ordinance. Renters or renter organizations can decide to assign their rights to a qualified organization, as I said earlier, selected by the city of Minneapolis through a qualified RFP process. They can assign their rights for more power in how the property is managed, limited rent increases, the right to participate in ongoing management of the property. As a couple of examples, they can negotiate things like that as part of their assignment. They cannot assign for direct financial benefit. We did make that decision after a lot of analysis and looking at some articles of how assignment has been occurring in DC. In the Washington, D.C. TOPA process, assignment can be done either to an individual or to an organization for cash or for the things I was describing. However, there's been a lot of analysis about problems with that, so we decided not to do that. Renters in larger buildings, which we defined as 5 units or larger, in this process will need to form a renters organization to act collectively. And to do that, they will need to have a simple majority of greater than 50%, so 51% or more, to agree to proceed under the opportunity to purchase ordinance. They also will need to work with a supportive partner. These are groups that are going to be selected by the city and certified to work with renter organizations, to work with them through this process on everything from securing financing to managing rental property and everything that goes with that. The rights automatically, as I said previously, go to qualified organizations if renters do not succeed in forming a renters organization or don't submit a statement of interest. Next slide, please. Our next step or next analysis to point out is that renters in smaller unit buildings, so 2 to 4 units, do not need to form a renters organization, but they do need to have a majority of the units in that building agree to exercise their rights under the ordinance. And in doing so, they can agree on any combination of the units and the renters to proceed with their rights under the ordinance. For transactions that move beyond a statement of interest process, sellers must allot periods of time to renters or renter organizations or qualified organizations or the city at each step in the process, from submitting the statement of interest and submitting earnest money to securing financing, etc., before closing. In addition, if the first offer is rejected, additional time is allowed to match a third-party offer. This is also referred to as the right of first refusal. If an offer is accepted, then time to secure financing and close the transaction is provided under the ordinance. In the next couple of slides, next slide please, we're going to look at the timelines that are provided. So on this slide, it outlines the process that we've just been talking about, but in a slightly different way. So as I explained earlier, on the left-hand side, it shows you that if the owner notifies the renters that they intend to sell, then the next thing that would happen is the renters or the renter organization representing all of the renters in the rental building submit a statement of interest, and then they would submit an offer and earnest money. Owner accepts the offer, and then they secure financing and close the sale. On the other hand, over on the right, the opportunity to purchase process would end if they do nothing, or if they do nothing and they don't assign their rights, and the city does nothing and a qualified organization does nothing, and all of the time periods expire. Or the renters or renter organization could decline to proceed or assign their rights to a qualified organization, or a third option is they could decline to pursue their rights, or the time period could run out and then it would fall to a qualified organization or the city, and either a qualified organization, one or multiple, and the city of Minneapolis could proceed with their rights under the process, which is again one of the benefits that this gives to property owners, is that they can end up with multiple parties competing to purchase the building under this ordinance. Next slide, please. On the next slide, we're going to see the same visual, but with the timelines. If you go to the website that I believe we're going to provide in the chat at another point, we have a website provided on the City of Minneapolis, within the City of Minneapolis website, that has this ordinance draft, this entire presentation, a survey you can respond to provide feedback about it, as well as all of this detailed information and all of these timelines, which we're not going to go through here, but just so that you can see what all of the timelines are at each step in the process. Next slide. The city intends to use a phased-in approach for two primary reasons. One, because this is a pretty complicated ordinance. There are a lot of jurisdictions across the United States that are considering implementing something similar, but not a lot of places in the United States that have actually done so other than Washington, D.C. So we want to be really thoughtful and intentional about how we do this. We also want to make sure that we have appropriate staffing and funding to do this in a way that it can be done successfully. With that in mind, we have 5 different phases outlined in this slide, starting with smaller properties. We did that based on community and public input, starting with smaller properties. And then by the time we get to phase 4, we would be at all building sizes. At each of these phases, we would be building out the compliance manual and all of the details that would go with implementing this, as well as bringing on city staff to implement this program. Next slide, please. Now we have an opportunity, and I think Katie's going to come back to facilitate our questions, but we are now going to have a question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. There are instructions on the slide for how to submit questions. I know questions have already been coming in. I will ask, I'm not sure who's going to be reading the questions, but whoever's going to be reading the questions, feel free to go ahead with our, Jessica, thank you. Go ahead with the first question.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. So the first question is, according to the January 2021 OTP policy options report, 1 to 4 unit properties comprise 87% of rental properties. According to your slide, 82% of those properties would be exempt. I don't think it's appropriate or useful to exempt a total of 71% of rental properties from the tenant protections like TOP. Am I misunderstanding something? And I think there's a similar question as well regarding the exemption. So I could probably read that second question off as well, just so that we answer it in one kind of in one go. Could you please explain why 1 to 4 unit buildings with LLCs that own fewer than 5, or with landlords, I think is what it's asking, that own fewer than 5 properties are exempt? According to my calculations, this means roughly 75% of all rental properties in Minneapolis are exempt.
Sure, thank you for that question. I can start, and then Michelle or others, if you would like to add to it, I'd welcome you to do so. So the questions, just to repeat, are related to why there are exemptions related to 1 to 4 unit buildings, and I think part of that we will gladly take as some feedback. I think part of that first question certainly sounded like some feedback that's a concern that questioner had. But I will start in that as I mentioned early in the introduction, the City Council did give us a staff direction that included a framework for this draft policy that we're presenting to you today. So some of the exemptions were spelled out in that draft framework, including that the policy should have an exemption for 1 to 4 unit buildings owned by an individual who has 5 or fewer rental licenses, and 1 to 4 unit buildings that are homesteaded, relative homesteaded, or partially homesteaded. And that was part of the report on policy options that we received last year. And the idea is that particularly if it's owner occupied, or if it's sort of a smaller property owner, kind of a mom and pop property owner, to not have them included in this policy just due to the challenges they may experience around implementation. And I'd welcome additional remarks from my colleagues on the line if they'd like to add anything to that. But that is really the why, is that was the direction we received in the framework. And certainly because part of today is to get feedback, and we can certainly take that feedback and make sure we are documenting that.
Great. The next question is, does the city plan to require qualified organizations and supportive partners that they must use the Minnesota Department of Commerce licensed salespersons or real estate agents? So the question is around a requirement for qualified organization and supportive partners, and whether they must use a licensed salesperson or real estate agents. Michelle, please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think that level of detail is considered in this draft ordinance. If this were to be adopted, there would need to be additional work done around a implementation manual and a policy manual for this policy, and we would need to establish a process for qualified organizations to apply to be deemed a qualified organization. And so much of the details of how a qualified organization
how an organization could be qualified will be spelled out in that implementation phase. But Michelle, please add to that if there's anything else I'm missing.
Katie, you're exactly right. That would be spelled out not only in the compliance manual, but also in the city's process to select qualified organizations in that RFP detail, which again would be publicly posted and available.
The next question says, thank you for the information. Apologies if I missed it, but how, if at all, would real estate agents fit into the process?
Thanks for that question. That's a good question, and I think again, I don't know that there's no specific role for real estate agents identified in the ordinance itself, but I think as implementation, if this were to be adopted, as implementation strategies and processes were being developed, there certainly may be roles for real estate agents, and I think as these conversations proceed, certainly be open to hearing about what real estate agents might envision as potential roles. I think, Michelle, I don't know if you in your peer city research have anything that you came across in other cities where there was a formal role, but I think this may be something that would be worked out a bit more in implementation.
I would agree with everything that you said, Katie. I would only add that based on what I saw, particularly in Washington, D.C., there were some realtors have provided information on their websites as well as attorneys regarding the process free of charge to help advise individuals generally or clients specifically about how they can take advantage of the process. And I did see some materials about that and review some materials about that as part of this process, but I have not seen any TOPA ordinance, DC or otherwise, that specifically addressed realtors' roles in the process.
The next question, it looks like it got cut off at the end, so if anyone wants to clarify that further down, please resubmit. But it says, what do you consider matching an offer? Maybe price is met by a renter or third party. And then the rest of that says, but the offer, and then it got cut off. So that the question, I think, is what do you consider matching an offer?
I thank you. This question around what would we consider matching an offer, and Michelle, I will turn to you on this. I do think it is matching the offer, the price, but then also terms. Michelle, can you expand on that?
I think the question is referring to the right of first refusal. After the parties go through a variety of different steps, then I had referred to in the presentation, there is a right of first refusal. If you go through the steps and follow the timelines provided, then either independently or after going to market, a property owner could receive offers from independent third parties, but have to offer any parties that had submitted in interest previously an opportunity for a right of first refusal. That right of first refusal, as Katie said, would have to be based on the materially substantially similar terms. So same price, same conditions.
Thank you, Michelle. The next question is the proposed implementation phases are a little confusing. Could you walk through those again?
Go ahead, Michelle, if you can do that.
So I'm going to make an assumption that this question is referring to the phase-in approaches as opposed to the steps of the ordinance. To the person who asked the question, if I'm incorrect, I apologize. Please resubmit your question But for now, I'm going to answer the phased-in approach and maybe just walk through this in a little bit more detail. So as we looked at this, and when I say we, Katie talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but we've had a project team working on this for a while, not too creatively, called the Opportunity to Purchase team. There are about 12 of us on the team, in addition to myself as an independent consultant, about 12 different people from across the city of Minneapolis, primarily from CPED, but also from the city attorney's office. And in considering different things, we decided to take a phased-in approach to this because we think that that will be, rather than trying to do all of it at once, we're not sure that it could be successfully implemented that way, given the complexity of this and the projected volume of sales in a given year. So phase one, organizations that will be able to participate in that will be renters, renter organizations, and the city of Minneapolis. And that will apply to buildings that are 10 years old or older, small unit properties, specifically single families, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. Second to last column here is our projected annual volume based on available data, with some limitations, albeit, is 137 buildings and 248 units. And our projected timeline is that we would complete phase one 6 months after securing the staffing and funding. And of course, in this job market nowadays, with as one of my colleagues who is our HR director says, employment is fickle, employees are fickle, things have changed. So we have to not only get the funding, but also get the employees. Without that, we can't implement this. Phase two, all entities, including qualified organizations, would be able to participate and take advantage of the opportunity to purchase. It would be for buildings 10 years old and older, and include property sizes that are up to 9 units. With each of these, the projected volume and thereby the projected amount of work gets a little heavier because we're adding to it as we go. And this would be effective 12 months after the implementation of phase one. The third phase would include all entities 10 years old and older, projected to be 191 buildings annually, or 1,212 rental housing units. The projected timeline for this is 6 months after securing staffing and funding, and the last phase is all entities, all building sizes, and all 1 to 4 unit properties, including those less than 10 years old if they're not excluded, and 10-year-old buildings for 5+ unit properties. This would require enhanced city support and service levels, and would be effective 12 months after phase 4. All of this is based on projected sales volume, which certainly we need to acknowledge could change and is fairly variable from year to year, which I'm sure realtors understand.
Thank you, Michelle. The next question is, in a current transaction, the buyer's ability to perform is disclosed with the offer. Thus, the seller can weed out non-qualified parties. Would this happen with the opportunity to purchase? If not, how long before the seller knows if the opportunity to purchase buyer can qualify for a loan?
Michelle, is that one you're able to address? I know that has been part of our discussions during the development process.
If we go back to the slide with the timelines, the graph with the timelines, that would be helpful. Great. Oh, one more slide forward, please. There you go. Perfect. So the point at which the seller would know whether or not the financing was approved would be after an offer was submitted. So first, again, the seller needs to decide to sell the building and issue in a notice of intent to sell and provide the parties an opportunity to submit a statement of interest. For each of these steps, it depends on the size of the building, how much time the parties have to submit to take the next step. We did that because that's what has been done in other jurisdictions, recognizing that the larger the rental building is, the more complicated the transaction, including the more difficult it is to secure financing and putting together a financing structure. So if we look at, for example, under the first step, statement of interest, 51 plus units, if they take the maximum amount of time, which we do not anticipate happening, but the maximum amount of time under a 51 plus unit building would be 105 days for that step. After that step, they then have to submit an offer and earnest money. At that point, they have another 105 days. And then after that, they have to secure financing in step 4. So that would be the point when the owner would know conclusively whether or not financing had been secured, is in step 4.
Thanks, Michelle. We have a comment and a question. This all seems really bad for owners, and if sellers have to go through all of those steps and extra delays in order to sell, it seems like owners would terminate their leases prior to listing, which would reduce the number of rental units in the city and therefore be bad for renters. Am I missing something?
Thanks, Jessica. I think that we will take in as feedback and a comment on this proposed draft. Thank you for that feedback.
Thanks, Katie. Next question. Would also like to hear more about supportive partners, qualified organizations, staffing, and funding concepts. With the understanding that this is all a proposal, what would it take to make this work?
I can start to answer that, and then I'd invite my colleagues to add more if you'd like. So I think the question is, what would it take to make this work, recognizing this is a proposal right now and that there's a lot of different components to it. And I think I'm going to guess that what this question is getting at is what would it take from a funding standpoint, perhaps, and probably staffing. So that's part of what that staffing phase-in approach is about, was trying to ensure that if this were to pass, that we could have time to appropriately staff up and be able to implement it. And that's from the city side. But then this would also involve a lot of partners external to the city, like the supportive partners and qualified organizations. In the study that LISC and CNHED did last year, they did recommend that the city consider funding technical assistance for external partners in order for this to be successful, in addition to adding staff internal to the city for implementation for it to be successful. And then, another recommendation from that report is also having funding to assist renters with the financing and being able to purchase properties as well. We have some existing programs that could be used, such as the small, medium, multifamily program that we currently use for naturally occurring affordable housing preservation. So we have some tools, but the report that we received last year did recommend looking for ways to increase those tools. And so I say all that to say that this is a policy and a draft ordinance. The city's budget process is separate from the ordinance development process. And so if this policy were to move forward, there would likely be need to be other budgetary considerations, and those discussions would happen through the city budget development process. Is that the last question, Jessica?
No, we have a few more, so I think we can probably go through one or two more and then move on to our comment section of the presentation. So I can go to the next two and then I think we can transition. So the next one that I have for you is how will you keep owners of large amount of properties from splitting their property into smaller shell groupings so they can become exempt?
That is a good question. I'm not sure if we have a specific answer to that. I think that may be something we need to consider as feedback and for further discussion. But you know, I think the idea was for the exemptions to be somebody with 5 or fewer licenses. I'm not sure how likely it is that a large owner would do that, but it is something, it sounds like something that we should probably dig into a little bit further and discuss. I don't know, Michelle or others, if you have any additional comments you want to add on that question specifically.
I don't, other than based on the amount of feedback we've gotten about the small unit exclusion. I think that that's definitely worth further consideration by the new council.
Sorry, this is Dean Porter Nelson. I just wanted to add briefly about that exemption to just clarify that the exemption is specifically for individuals and it is not for corporations or companies. Corporations or companies that own small 1 to 4 unit properties are automatically subject to this ordinance under the current language. However, individuals, you know, for example, if I personally owned a property as an individual, I would, you know, not be subject to that if I only owned, say, 3 properties. But if I had my properties owned by LLCs or by corporate entities, then those properties owned by those corporate entities would be subject to the ordinance. With all that being said, yes, please do submit comments related to this section of the ordinance.
Thank you for that, Dean. And I think the last question here before we have a section where we're going to move on to give you a chance to do a public comment through calling in. So this last question before we transition to that is how does someone who purchasing in a property and needing to sell their property for a 1031 exchange and has a shorter time constraint, this policy appears to prohibit an owner's ability to do a sale in a timely fashion to perform a 1031 exchange on a chosen property to purchase.
Thank you. I am not recalling at the moment. I believe we at least considered 1031 exchanges. Dean or Michelle, can you elaborate on that? Otherwise, that may be a question we need to take back as feedback and follow up on. Okay, I think we will have to. Oh, go ahead, Dean.
So thank you for your comment and question. At this point in time, 1031 exchanges are not specifically included. I would just note that it is difficult, if not impossible, for city staff to track when a 1031 exchange is taking place, and to have that be an exemption from an ordinance, it is hard for staff to be able to track when that's going on, when it is not going on. But if you have suggestions on that, I would encourage you to submit those as comments.
And the only comment I would add to what Dean just said is that there are a lot of circumstances and situations that are going to arise with this that we acknowledge that all of the details are not anticipated and spelled out even in an 18-page draft ordinance, which we will be further developing if and when an ordinance is adopted in a compliance and an operations manual.
All right, thank you. Thank you for all those questions. I think we will move on now to the opportunity for attendees to provide verbal feedback or comments in the chat. Go to the next slide. I believe it has the call-in information on it. Great, thank you. So here on this slide, you can see a call-in number and a conference ID. If you'd like to make a comment, please call in and then dial that conference ID, and that will get you into the meeting. You will need to hit *6 to unmute your phone. We will call on you by the last 4 digits of your phone number. We do ask, just because we do have quite a few attendees, and we want to make sure those who want to speak have a chance to do so. Just keep your comments to 2 minutes or less. Please just keep in mind this is not a public hearing. This is a feedback session on this draft ordinance. And so just wanted to give that reminder. And it's an initial draft. Most helpful comments are those that would inform content. And again, this, just to reiterate what I shared at the beginning, if the next council is going to consider this ordinance, it will need to be reintroduced. And we don't know yet what will happen when the new council meets, but we certainly wanted to at least have an opportunity to share what we've been working on this year and get some feedback to inform anything that may happen with the new council. So again, please feel free to call in now to make comments if you would like to, and we are happy to hear from you. But if you don't want to call in here, you can also submit comments, written comments through the website. And I hope that link has been shared. I believe it has. We'll wait another minute or two, and perhaps there aren't any comments. Nobody wants to give comments today, which is fine, but we wanted to at least have the opportunity. So again, the call-in information is on the screen if you would like to provide a comment here today.
And Katie, if there are no comments, there are a few questions we still have left to answer, so we could always go back to that as well.
Great. Why don't we do that? We'll leave the call-in information up on the screen, and you can still dial in if you decide you'd like to give a comment, and we can let you into the meeting that way. But while we're waiting, why don't we go back to the questions, the remaining questions.
All right. The next question that we have. It's loading. Under this draft, would a landlord who owns an exempt property still need to provide renters an intention to sell notification prior to selling?
Sorry, Jessica, can you repeat the question? I missed the first part.
Yes. So under this draft, would a landlord who owns an exempt property still need to provide renters an intention to sell notification prior to selling?
Michelle, can you answer that question?
I can. Under the ordinance, as it's currently drafted, no, the property owner would not need to do that. However, there is a requirement that the property owner would need to issue a statement to the city, and off the top of my head, I believe also to the renters, providing notice of what exemption that they believe applies to their situation.
Thanks for that, Michelle.
Yeah.
Oh, We do have one caller ending in 2196 that called in to make a comment.
Please go ahead with your comment. You'll need to press *6 to unmute your line.
Hi.
Hi, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Erin West. I'm a tenant organizer at Homeline. I'm also
Erin, sorry, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. There's some feedback in the background.
limiting the ability of renters to assign their rights. I know that currently in this draft that renters will only be able to assign rights to qualified.
Erin, I don't know if you can hear me. We can't hear you.
And cited some data from DC about how that threatens affordability. I would say that, the percentage of sales that this affects in the city is small. And we know that gentrification is happening at a rapid scale in the city of residents, and at a minimum, renters should be able to have access to some of the wealth that their properties is generating.
Can others hear Erin?
According to that data, there were sometimes buyouts that renters got $50,000, which is, a down payment on the house. So renters should be able to access that wealth if possible. If the city is really serious about curbing gentrification, it should be considering rent stabilization across the board. That would go much further and apply much more widely. And in general, this is just an issue of trusting renters to make their own decisions about their well-being and the wealth they hope to generate, and not limiting the choice of renters and deciding what happens to their building. And again, just they should be able to access wealth from properties that they invest in via renting. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Apologize, we missed some or quite a bit of your comments, but we did catch the end, and I appreciate you weighing in on renter choice and renter protections. Sorry we weren't able to hear you for part of that. I don't know if there's anything you want to add. I think we kind of heard you at the end about renters in other communities receiving enough in payments to go toward a down payment of a house, and your comments on rent stabilization. I don't know if you want to quickly add anything else that we may have missed.
I think that covers it. I was just kind of leading up to that evidence, which was that generally I support widening the ability of renters to assign their rights to include individuals or for-profit developers and not limiting it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thanks for your comments. And it looks like we have another person who has called in ending in 3803. So please go ahead, just press *6 to unmute your phone. Go ahead, it looks like you're unmuted. Hi, if you number ending in 3803, go ahead if you're wanting to make a comment. We can't hear you if you are speaking. It does look like your line's unmuted.
How about now? Is this better?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Excellent. I appreciate the opportunity for a comment. As a property owner of the rental property, I understand many of the issues that have been identified for renters. I feel like I'm having rights taken away, specifically any opportunities for a 1031 exchange, that those have not been addressed, and those are critical for investors. And I do appreciate that renters are paying their rent, but that's different than making an investment. That's different than paying $10,000 for a new boiler or new roof and things like that. So as a owner, looking at some of these timelines that stretch from 45 to 90 to 120 days, looking at a small number of cities, it sounds like a N of 1 that have done something like this. This is a lot to undertake, and you're putting people like myself, who I would consider a small investor, at risk. And I don't understand why there aren't other options other than taking the opportunity for me to sell my property when I want to, in the time frame that I want or the market will allow, and just sort of give the city the right to create a bureaucracy. And finally, and I appreciate the time constraints, I think that these organizations that will be created create their own problems, as well as, in the end, they might create what the market is, which may send prices down. And with that, that'll probably reduce the value of the property, which will reduce the investments that people are willing to make. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you for your comments. Appreciate that. It doesn't look like we have anyone else who has called in at the moment. We can leave the call-in information up on the slide in case anyone else would like to do so. Jessica, do we have any other questions that we can take at this time?
Yes, we do. So I can go ahead with the next one while we wait for any other callers. So the next question is, do other cities considering implementing opportunity to purchase have large proportions of small 1 to 4 unit rental properties like Minneapolis?
Thank you for that question. That's a good question. And Michelle, I will see if you have any information you can share from some of the peer city research that I know you did. I think our market does look different than Washington, D.C., definitely. And I know there are other cities considering this currently, or similar ordinances currently. So could you comment on that, Michelle?
Thank you, Katie. I would agree. Our market does look different. DC actually did implement a small unit, small renter portfolio exemption fairly recently in the last couple of years. Some of the other jurisdictions I looked at that are considering but have not yet implemented a similar ordinance do not have a similar exemption.
Thank you for that. The next question is, does the city anticipate that qualified organizations would be able to provide support in each and every transaction where tenants are interested? Overall capacity? Or what is their overall capacity?
Thank you. That is a good question. And that question came up in our last stakeholder meeting as well. And I'd welcome Roxanne. I think you may have commented on this last time, and Michelle as well. But it is one of the things that, as we are if this were to be adopted, and as we were working on an implementation plan and a compliance manual, we would need to make sure that as we were seeking qualified organizations, it was the requirements around it are broad enough that there would be enough organizations who would qualify so that they could support the level of activity that we would see in sales. But Michelle or others, if you have anything to add to that, please do.
I do not have anything to add.
And neither do I, Katie. I think you summarized that accurately.
Thank you both.
The next question, what can property owners, sellers do if they have to sell quickly? Let's say they're in foreclosure and have 60 days or less to go in the redemption period.
Michelle, could you comment on this? I believe there are some considerations around foreclosures in the ordinance draft.
This actually was brought up a couple of times in our last meeting. The ordinance draft does not currently anticipate a property that's currently in foreclosure or pre-foreclosure.
So I would just add, as Michelle mentioned, that came up in the last meeting as well. So that is feedback that we will be taking back and reviewing because it has been a point that we've heard a few times now.
So apologies, Michelle. So I'm just noticing that we have this kind of summarized on this slide. There's obviously much more detailed language, but it does say that certain types of property transfers are also exempted, such as the transfer of property based on a court order. So I'm just trying to remember if we do have maybe something in there on this already, and maybe we could publish a little bit more of a detailed FAQ when we get to the compliance manual, or if this is still something that needs to be revisited more fully in this ordinance.
Thank you for showing that, Dean. Go ahead, Michelle, if you had something you wanted to respond to.
I do not need to at this time, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and we will, yeah, that would be something that would be very helpful for staff to look into further. So thank you.
The next question that we have, is it true that 3 buildings were successfully purchased collectively in 2021 without the opportunity to purchase?
If others have comments on this, I don't know if this is referring to the Skies Without Limits Cooperative, which was not 2021. I think it was 2019 or 2020. Dean, do you have any insight you could share on this question?
I'm sorry, I was trying to look up this question about foreclosures. Can you please restate the question?
The question was whether there were 3 properties purchased in 2021 by, I'm probably misquoting it here, 3 by renters without this ordinance being in place. Do I have that right, Jessica?
Yes, that's correct.
So Dean, I think this may be referencing the Skies Without Limits Cooperative, and I don't know if you could just touch briefly on that, which was not 2021, but
Thank you. So in 2020, there was a transaction that was through something called the city's small and medium multifamily loan fund. Through that, a loan was provided to a group called a nonprofit called the Twin Cities Land Bank that worked in collaboration with a group of tenant organizers known as the Sky Without Limits community. And 5 buildings were purchased in the Corcoran neighborhood. That was not through the opportunity to purchase ordinance. The opportunity to purchase ordinance is currently not in effect. It was not in effect at that time, but that's an example of an organization collaborating with renter groups to purchase a building from its owners. But that is just one specific example. That's not specifically what would be envisioned under this ordinance, but it is one example of that type of transaction.
Thanks for that, Dean. The next question is, does the ordinance draft include an annual report or sunset review requirement? How will we know if the ordinance is successful?
Thank you. Michelle, can you respond to that question?
Yes, there is an annual reporting and disclosure requirement outlined in the ordinance. There's, I don't think, any details about that in the presentation, but the ordinance does anticipate an annual report that would be published by the city of Minneapolis, including reporting on on the volume of properties that have been transacted under the opportunity to purchase.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Next question, why are qualified organizations being given first place in real estate transactions instead of free and fair competition?
Michelle, I don't know if you want to take this. I can just share that the concept of ability, so it would be, I'm sorry, I will be right back. Michelle, could you take over answering that one for most?
So part of the policy approach in this is that first to give the rights to renters and renter organizations, again, referencing one of the things I said earlier, which is that the majority of residents in the city of Minneapolis for a couple of years now are renters and have trended to be renters, and we don't anticipate that changing. In the absence of renters wanting to execute their rights under this ordinance, the City Council authors of the ordinance next thought that it was important to identify qualified organizations who have a commitment to either preserving or creating affordable housing. And we did that because we don't necessarily, because we want this to be entities that are committed to affordable housing under this ordinance. That is what it is intended to serve as a policy goal.
Thank you, Michelle. So this is the last question I have in queue. What if an owner sells a property to a buyer that was never marketed for sale? If someone makes an offer and the owner decides to sell, are they prohibited from selling to that buyer?
So I think if I understand the question correctly, is if are they prohibited from selling to a buyer if no one else? I'm sorry?
If they never marketed the property for sale.
Regardless, they would still have to follow if this ordinance applies to them. And again, the presumption is that the ordinance applies to all rental properties unless they fall within one of the specific exemptions. They would need to follow this process, starting with providing their renters, renter organizations, etc., with a notice of intent to sell. Even if they did not intend to sell, but they unsolicited receive an offer of sale, they would then have to, if that then causes them to be interested in selling the building, they would need to then issue a notice of intent to sell.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
That was the last question we had in queue. And let me just check one more time. It doesn't look like we have any other callers waiting to make a statement.
All right.
I will note that there were several comments that were submitted in the question and answer, and I just want to briefly state that we saw your comments and we will be including them in the community feedback.
Thank you, Roxanne, for acknowledging that. And with that, I think we can wrap up, but we do just want to thank everyone for your time and interest. And please do feel free to submit additional comments on the website. But thank you so much for taking the time to listen in today and provide us with additional feedback. And certainly as we do know more about next steps, feedback we've received today will be incorporated in any future discussions around this type of policy. So thank you so much for your time and for joining the call this afternoon.